Short part 2 of the making gains here because I reached the limit. I guess my videos can only be like 33 minutes long, so whatever. Anyways, how many activists were killed during the Mississippi Freedom Summer Project? Was it 1, 2, 3, or 4? If you want to see a movie about this, that was pretty good. It's called Mississippi Burning, starring a young Gene Hackman. I forget which streaming platform that's on, but it's all about these murders and how they solved them. All right, next big one will be the Selma marches. Okay, this is a group demonstration. It is a non-violent protest. But Martin Luther King organizes a voter registration march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. That is a long march. But they're going to march peacefully with signs, and they'll be chanting, they'll be singing to try and get people to realize how ridiculously hard it was to get registered to vote in Alabama. There were all sorts of things in place. Poll taxes, where you had to literally pay a tax if you wanted to register to vote. Literacy tests, which were put out in such a way that it was up to the clerk to decide if you passed or didn't. So, naturally, white people passed it and black people didn't. They had things called grandfather clauses, where they'd ask you if your grandfather had voted. And if you said no, they said, well, sorry, if your grandfather wasn't eligible to vote, then you can't vote. That's just the way it works, which, of course, disenfranchises black people. They would ask you all sorts of questions like name every single elected official in the state, or name the elected officials of this county or whatever, as all sorts of pop quiz type of things to try to keep black people from being registered to vote. So King organizes this march to bring attention to that. Governor Wallace of that state attempts to stop the march. He encourages his police to use violence against the marchers. So they will use tear gas and clubs to beat the marchers. We call this Bloody Sunday. Every year they recreate Bloody Sunday, or at least they recreate the march over the Edmund Pettus Bridge there in Selma, Alabama. And I'll show you some pictures here. I'll attach videos too so you can see what Bloody Sunday actually looked. Another instance where, of course, we have TV cameras now. TV cameras following the march. TV cameras filming this police brutality, which again is going to bring more support to the civil rights protesters. They will eventually have 3 total marches. So the first march ends up in Bloody Sunday where they get beaten. The second march, they stop on the bridge because they didn't feel like they were going to get protected from the police again. The third march will be successful because President Johnson sends troops to escort the marchers all the way to Montgomery. So the victory here, in the end, is that this pressure from King and from his groups and from other civil rights leaders will lead to the passage of what we call the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Voting Rights Act will be an intensely important piece of legislation that we have allowed to lapse, which is a tragedy in our country. We allowed that to lapse, but what it did is it increased voting for disadvantaged groups like minorities. It took away those poll taxes, those literacy tests. It took away those grandfather clauses. It made it easier for people to get registered. It put federal election observers in places where violence had occurred in the past. The voting rate for African Americans will go up 50% within 2 years of the passage of this law. They finally, 100 years after we had told them they had the right to vote, they finally actually have the right to vote. So, some pictures of the march. So on the left, we got marchers. On the right, we got marchers carrying flags, reading newspapers as they go, chanting, that sort of a thing. And then we get to Bloody Sunday. So there's this bridge called the Edmund Pettus Bridge, not exactly named for a non-racist guy, but they march over the bridge. The police are waiting for them. They tell them to disperse. They do not disperse. They stand peacefully, and then they get beaten. The police march in with billy clubs, shooting tear gas at them. They ride in on horses and hitting them from on top of their horseback positions. Lots of people get hurt. There was a representative, his name was John Lewis, he just recently died, who was there at the march and had his skull fractured. They had to drag him away, completely unconscious, barely survived. So that's what we call Bloody Sunday. And again, like I said, I will attach a video to this lecture so you can see it in real time. But I would recommend, we're all at home, so we got stuff we can watch too. Some really well-made movies. A movie called Selma, which is just about the marches, was only made a few years ago, which is really good. If you go on YouTube and just Google Eyes on the Prize from PBS, or you go on YouTube and search Eyes on the Prize, they've got some episodes on the march, which you can access for free. So, Public pressure and publicity after the Selma voting rights marches and Bloody Sunday helped lead to the passage of what law? Was it A, the Civil Rights Act of 64, B, the Voting Rights Act of 65, C, the Fair Housing Act of 67, or D, the 15th Amendment? So continuing with that Voting Rights Act of 65 that we talked about, is signed by LBJ, President Lyndon Baines Johnson, is one of the most far-reaching and important pieces of civil rights legislation that we ever passed. The act will ban the use of literacy tests. It will provide for federal oversight of voter registration in areas where less than 50% of the non-white population had not registered to vote, and authorize the U.S. Attorney General to investigate local elections. So to make sure that these places who had discriminated in the past weren't continuing to discriminate. This will have huge political implications. Okay, signing this bill will lead to the formation of the more current Democratic and Republican parties. This is a bit of a controversial topic, the party switch theory, but it's one that isn't, if you really look at all the evidence, it's not all that controversial. So the parties started shifting in the late 1920s into the 30s into the New Deal, right? Where bigger government people who believe that the government could be an agent of good and should expand in times of need like this, started to flock to the Democratic Party, and people who were against that started to flock to the Republican Party. That opposition to bigger government programs, to New Deal legislation, will also take a racial element where some of these New Deal programs start helping black people, which will encourage black people to join the Democratic Party, especially Southern blacks, who had traditionally been part of the Republican Party because the Republican Party was the party of Abraham Lincoln, and that was the party that freed the slaves. So as all of this stuff starts shifting, different economic policies, different government policies, different racial policies, you see a lot of people flocking to the Democratic Party. You see a lot of people who don't like those who are coming into the Democratic Party leaving and starting their own party, the Dixiecrat Party, and then eventually leaving the Dixiecrat Party and joining the Republican Party. So this is where we call it the party shift or the party switch. So the fallout will lead to the parties to polarize even further. Democrats will tend to become more liberal during this time period. Republicans continuing to become more conservative. So the solidly Republican South becomes a solidly Republican South during this time period, right? And the more Democratic North becomes the more Democratic North during this time period, over fights of New Deal, economic legislation, expanding federal government, and of course, yes, civil rights. So with all that said, roll back here. Supreme Court struck down parts of the bill that required federal oversight in states that have histories of discrimination. This happened in 2008. Supreme Court decided that we live in a post-racial society. So what ends up happening? A huge reduction in minority voting in the last presidential election because a lot of places will get shut down. There was just a story through NPR and ProPublica that said that the state of Texas shut down hundreds of voting locations in majority Latino areas. Same with Arizona, same with other states. Ohio shut down a lot of places, voting locations in majority minority areas. There's also big questions surrounding the idea of voter ID laws. There is not much voter fraud in America. There's no real reporting that can prove that there's more than a very infinitesimal small amount of it. But there's still a question about whether or not you should present your ID when you vote. And if they're going to do that, how do they ensure that poor minority folks actually get IDs? They shut down a bunch of DMVs in poor minority areas in Alabama and then instituted a voter ID laws, and these people couldn't go get their IDs because there were no DMVs around them. So that is all winding its way through the court system to see whether or not that's legal. Whew, lots of stuff going on. As we talk about the party switch thing, I do want to make sure to emphasize that it was not just over racial issues. It was over a whole bunch of issues, but race did play a part in it. Okay, and we need to acknowledge that as well. It's not to say that all Southerners were racist or are racist or all Republicans were racist or are racist or anything like that. Just there were some people who decided that that was the reason to leave the Democratic Party. But there were others who had other reasons for leaving the Democratic Party, which is how we get the more modern alignment that we have. Anyways, there's LBJ here signing the Voting Rights Act, and he made sure that Dr. King was there and that he got one of the pens. All right, that is it for this portion of the Civil Rights Movement.